Hey there, it's been a while. I was banned from the internet. No, I'm just kidding. I wanted to take a few weeks off of recording podcasts or making any videos, unless it was specifically for work. Just because I've been, I think for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been trying to really cut down, or I had been really trying to cut down on my technology use, which even just recording anything even podcasts and listening to music. It's what I do every once in a while. I'll do what's called a digital detox, where I really cut down on any use of technology. This can even mean like listening to music while driving, listening to a podcast while walking, things like that. I did it once in 2019, and it really helped me focus on what was most important, because I believe that we have limited bandwidth for mental tasks or stimulation, media consumption, emotional expenditure, things like that, energy in general. And I find that I'm, I think like a lot of people, I'm often trying to fill that empty space, whether I'm driving or I have maybe 15 minutes I'm waiting in the doctor's office for my appointment. These moments of empty space, I'm just going to say it that way, where sometimes we feel like we need to play music or listen to a podcast or check our phones, which is one of the most common things these days, of course, whether that's social media, texting, whatever. And I find that cutting down on that really helps me think about what's most important, and also helps me realize what I don't need. So, the idea behind a digital detox is you take away a lot of things for a few weeks, and then you decide what you want to bring back into your life. And so, what people hopefully find is that some things they decide are very helpful and they bring those things back into their lives, and some things are not helpful or they're actually causing more stress, like maybe checking the news every night. And so they'll remove those things, or Instagram or TikTok or something. So I don't want to talk too much about it. I just want to explain why I've been away from my podcast for a while. I know how many people do I have? Like 50 or 60 subscribers. And I'm pretty sure some of those are bots. They're not real anyway. But I just thought I'd mention that in case anyone who is listening is interested in doing like a digital detox. Um, maybe, yeah, anyway. I can't remember what I was going to say. I already forgot. But yeah, it's been very helpful. And also just in general, you just kind of come back fresher. So what I'm doing now is I've eliminated or cut out a lot of things from my life related to technology. One extra thing I've been doing, which has been super helpful, is not just putting the phone and my computer and my iPad and my iPod and my video games, all that, putting that away when I don't need it, so I don't have it near me. And if I need it, I go get it, right? Or if I get a phone call, I can hear it, of course, right? But if it's a text message, it's probably not that important. If it's really important, somebody will call. But what I found was very helpful is actually just turning off the internet, or turning off the router and modem in my apartment. Now, I know for a lot of people who are not living alone, that's probably impossible or very difficult. So I do understand that. I live alone. I have my pets, of course. But if I want to turn off the internet, I can just turn it off. So I'll just say that. Okay, so anyway, that kind of sort of brings me to my next point, though. So the topic for today, it's something I'm always talking about, is taking ownership of your language learning, or being responsible for your language learning. And this is something this podcast is mainly for my current and former students. And so you know that I always talk about responsibility for your learning. You are the one who is ultimately responsible for your learning. You have a bad teacher, you still need to do what you need to do, right? You don't have any people in your house who speak English, well, you need to find other opportunities, right? Everyone at work speaks your first language, so you don't have any opportunities to use English. You got to figure something out. You don't have time. Everybody has some time. You need to find the time. And I always say, if it's really not that important, that's okay too. You just have to accept that, or be honest with yourself that it's not a priority, and that you have other priorities, which is perfectly fine too. I think as long as we're honest with ourselves, that can also relieve a lot of the burden and the pressure. of trying to do something that we really don't have time or energy to do, right? If we want to do something, we find the way. We find time, we find the energy, and so on. So we make an effort. So I wanted to talk about something. I may have touched upon this before, but I was talking with somebody recently who is an English learner, and then it kind of gave me the idea for this episode, and it's something that I used to do. So often what happens is that, and I've talked about this before, where I think for a lot of English learners, their confidence is lower than their ability. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of people have the ability, their proficiency level and their knowledge of English is higher than what they're able to show or express. Now, sometimes that's because they're nervous and so the words don't come out. Or they're stressed out because maybe they're processing too much information, like maybe a long lecture, there's a long meeting. And so they have the knowledge, they should be able to understand everything in the meeting, but because it's so long and it's overwhelming and there's no breaks, then maybe their ability to process kind of inhibits their ability to comprehend, if that makes sense. So just because we say we know something or we think we know something doesn't mean we can actually apply it in real life. I mean, this happens all the time, right? People graduate from school supposedly having all this knowledge, but they don't know how to actually use it. Or somebody has training in a task, but when they're in that real situation, they don't have the mental or emotional preparation, or they're nervous or they panic, and so they're not able to actually perform. And I think language is very similar. I've had this experience, of course, many times. For those of you who don't know, I lived in Japan for 6 years. I studied Japanese for about 20 years. It was a lot of difficulties. I would feel like I'm ready for something, for a conversation, and then I would start talking and my mind would go blank. And I think it's not just, you have to remember, it's not just a language thing. Or because it's a second language. I mean, this may happen in your first language. Sometimes you do blank out during a meeting because it's boring or too long, even though you understand every word, right? And then somebody asks you, okay, what was the meeting about? And you say, I don't know, because I couldn't focus. I couldn't pay attention. I couldn't remember. Sometimes you have a speech in your first language, right? And you just can't get the words out. So I think we have to realize that a lot of it is about not just our knowledge of the language or our preparation, but just who we are, our personalities, how we deal with stress, and so on. So my point was, a lot of times what happens is in the moment, we don't know how to express something in that second language. In this case, we're focusing on English, right? So maybe you're having a conversation with somebody and you want to express an idea in your mind. Let's say it's in Spanish. And then you kind of know how to say it in English, but it won't come out exactly the way you want it to, or maybe it just won't. You just don't have no idea what to say, even though the Spanish is in your head. You don't know how to say that in English or express it in a more natural way. And this happens all the time. It happened to me all the time in Japan. Here's what I did, at least what I tried to do when I remembered, is, and you got to remember, I lived in Japan. I first moved to Japan in 2004. My mom is Japanese. She's from Japan, so I did go to Japan every summer as a kid. We're talking 1 month per year, so maybe a total of over a year throughout my childhood. But at that time, I didn't really care about Japanese. I always liked Japan, and I watched Japanese cartoons, but I never really studied. I was never interested in studying it as a kid. It wasn't until probably my junior year of high school that I started to actually become interested and started thinking about moving to Japan as well. And that's when I took studying seriously, and something just clicked. But what I'm trying to say is that when I was an adult, this would happen a lot, where I wanted to say something and I couldn't get the words out in Japanese. Either I was nervous, or I couldn't think. I didn't have enough time to think on the spot, or I just didn't know I just didn't have the vocabulary, perhaps. So what I tried to do, and again, this was before smartphones, is I would write it down in my notebook, maybe at that moment, or maybe, later. I would try to remember it, and I would write down what I wanted to say in English, which is my first language, of course. So I would write down what I wanted to say in English, And then I would either use my dictionary later to try to translate it. Remember, there was no smartphones at this time, no ChatGPT, no Google Translate. Now, using the internet, I was able to translate things a little bit later when I lived in Japan, but still it was pretty basic stuff, right? So either I would try to translate it by myself, or I would just ask somebody, a native Japanese speaker. I'd say, hey, how would you say this in Japanese, right? Often they also spoke English, which helped, but sometimes they only knew Japanese, but I was able to kind of explain it in Japanese, and then they would help me say it in a more natural way, if that makes sense. So using my dictionary to kind of get the direct translation, but then asking a Japanese person or a native speaker of Japanese, because they might not actually be a Japanese person, but maybe they speak it natively at a native level, right? You have to remember that. Anybody can speak a language at a native level. It doesn't mean that that's their ethnicity or nationality, right? So I would ask them to help me make it sound more natural, because that's also very important. And I know a lot of the listeners to this podcast and my students in general, they're not just concerned with getting the correct vocabulary and grammar, but they also want to use English in a more natural way, which I totally understand. Using idiomatic language, making sure that they're using phrasal verbs and it doesn't sound too awkward or too stiff, or they want to make sure if the situation is casual, they want to sound casual. If the situation is formal, they want to sound formal. And there is no textbook that is going to teach you everything that you need to know. There is no podcast. There is no language learning program or software. There is no teacher. There is no class that is going to teach you everything that you need to know. They can teach you maybe the most important things. They can teach you the most common things you need to know. They can teach you the basic principles, but they can't teach you everything. I mean, that would be impossible, right? So what you need to do, and this is where you taking ownership of your language learning, you taking responsibility, no excuses for your own language learning comes into play, is the next time you want to say something or write something, but you want to communicate something in English and you don't know how to express it, you gotta try writing it down in your first language. Making a note in your phone, in your notebook, in ChatGPT, whatever. But don't go home or at the end of the day, don't say, I didn't know what to say. Okay, that's okay. That's no problem, right? But what are you going to do about it? You're going to just cry and say, I didn't know what to say. My English is not good. No, of course not, right? You got to say, I didn't know what to say. Here's what I wanted to say in my first language. And then, how do I say that in English? I'm going to ask ChatGPT to help me. I'm going to use Google Translate. I'm just going to check the words myself. I'm going to ask my teacher. I know a lot of my students, or not a lot, but some of my students are married to native speakers of English, or they have coworkers who are native speakers of English, so they don't have to rely on only the teacher. Their kids, a lot of students have kids born here, right? Most of my students with children, their children were born here. They are native speakers of English. You can ask them. You can ask your neighbor, whatever, right? And of course, you can use AI tools like ChatGPT. So you really don't have any excuses. It's something I always say, right? I'm not saying this to criticize anyone or to make too hard of a judgment, right? If you're listening to this, it's probably because you like my teaching style, okay? If you're a student, you probably like my teaching style. That's why you're listening to it. And I always talk about this, responsibility. You are ultimately responsible, right? And I think when you do take that responsibility, I think you, hopefully, I mean, I always felt better because I didn't feel helpless, right? Now, it doesn't mean that it's easy. It's still uncomfortable. It's stressful. It can be stressful. And when you take responsibility for something, I mean, I wouldn't say there's a lot of pressure on you, but when you can't make excuses or when you stop making excuses, sometimes that's a little uncomfortable too, right? But I think you feel better in the long run, right? And the next time that same situation appears where you didn't know what to say, now you know what to say, right? And I think that also can build your confidence as well. I hope that's kind of making sense. And one thing that's kind of a side point to that is if you don't know what to say exactly, I know a lot of students or language learners, myself included, a lot of people learning a language will kind of say, okay, how do I say this in English? But I don't know how to say it exactly, so I'm not going to say anything, right? Okay, that is not good, right? You've just kind of broken down, the communication has kind of stopped, right? So what I tried to do in Japan, again, I didn't do this all the time, and it took me a long time to develop that confidence and this skill, is I would try to explain it in Japanese. Now, I didn't know exactly how to say it, something in Japanese, like how to express that exact phrase or even word, but I would try to explain the situation. I would try to use examples. And even if I couldn't get exactly what I wanted to say, we could still kind of continue that conversation, or I could still kind of communicate my ideas. And it wasn't always successful. It's awkward. I mean, it's embarrassing sometimes, right? At least for me, and then sometimes it's like, who cares? Maybe it wasn't that important too. Maybe that's another thing to remember. Sometimes the conversation topic is really not that important. We think it's very important. We think getting that exact word is important, or communicating our ideas exactly accurately, precisely. We think that's important. A lot of times I think it's not. I think a lot of times our conversations are not really about the content. I think a lot of times our conversations are about just being able to connect with other people, to show interest, to show that you are interested in the other person, that you want to maintain an open line, and that your ideas don't have to be exchanged exactly. And honestly, like I was telling this other person who's an English learner, which prompted me to record this podcast, or at least choose this topic, is I think a lot of times we aren't paying careful attention. I mean, if you really listen to a conversation in your first language or in English or whatever, a lot of times the conversation topics keep changing. And people aren't really too focused on one thing. They're jumping around topics. It really didn't matter what your opinion was. They just kind of wanted to start a conversation, hear you say something, fill that empty space. Conversations will end abruptly and nobody really cares because it was just a way to kill time. We have 5 minutes before the meeting starts. Let's just talk about anything, and it doesn't really matter. I don't want to say it in a cynical way, but what I'm trying to say is a lot of conversation is, in any language really, is not about the content itself, but it's about just showing an interest, trying to maintain a connection with somebody. And sometimes it's just about killing time, just filling that empty space. You have 5 or 10 minutes while you're waiting for the bus, and you're just blah, 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 right? And so I think sometimes we put too much pressure on ourselves to say the exact thing. And I do this too, even in English, right? How do I express my opinion in English? How do I articulate my thoughts about this topic? And then sometimes I kind of realize, well, it didn't really matter because we weren't having a serious discussion anyway. So that's what I find out a lot too. And I have to remember, well, not every conversation is a heavy conversation. Not every conversation is a debate where we need to have precise arguments and ideas and and research-based statements and things like that. And if I'm losing track perhaps, but what I'm trying to say is to tie it back into the first point is that, yes, I know that you want to express yourselves in English as well as you can in your first language. I understand that pressure that you put on yourself or expectation that you have of yourself. I had the same thing of myself when I was in Japan. I really wanted to be able to communicate in Japanese almost as clearly as I can in English. I never got to that point. I did a good job. I think I was independent, but I think my mindset was really good. Like I said, is that if I didn't know how to say something, I would write it down in English and try to find how to say that in Japanese later. Or I would just ask the person. If I saw a sign on the street and I didn't understand it, I would take a picture, or I would write down the character, the Japanese. I would write it down, and I would check my dictionary later. As much as possible, I tried not to say, oh, I don't know this. I always tried to say, I don't know this, I don't know how to say this, or I don't know how to read this, but I'm going to find out. And I think that attitude helped me a lot. And I think this is something that I always encourage my students to do this. I actually, one more thing, I do want to cut it off. It's almost 20 minutes, and I don't want to go too much over that. But one thing that I used to do in Japan at the university, and teaching at the university, with a credit program where the students have a lot of homework and they come every day. It's a very different environment from my current teaching, which is non-credit, which is more relaxed. I think we have more fun, but we also don't have the same expectations of projects. Well, we don't have any projects really. Everything we do is basically done in class, and people come and go as they please. And it's just a completely different environment. So I don't do it as much, but I want to try doing it again. So here's what I did at the university. And of course, everyone was a native or not almost everyone was a native Japanese speaker, so it was a little bit easier. But what I did at the university in Japan was at the end of class or during class, I told students, if you want to say something in if you want to say something in English in your discussion or to me, but you don't know how to say it, I want you to write it down in Japanese. That's what I would tell them. Write it in your notebook in Japanese, what you want to say. And then at the end of class, we're going to work together and we're going to translate those into English, and I'm going to help you make it sound more natural. And of course, because my Japanese was pretty good at that time, I could also understand what they wrote in Japanese. I could understand that as well, but I deliberately chose not to use Japanese in a classroom. First of all, you're not really supposed to. It's supposed to be English only. And if I did use Japanese, it was usually just once in a while as like a joke or just to show that I understood something, but I would never make that part of the classroom, basically. Very rarely. So what we would do at the end of class is we would gather together everyone's phrases in Japanese, what they wanted to say, and then we would talk about how to say that in English. And now we couldn't do it for every single phrase, but I was trying to instill this habit in the students, again, of being proactive, taking ownership of your own language learning. And it was very interesting. It's not really something you can do exactly in my current teaching context because, first of all, people speak different, people come from different language backgrounds. So, if we do it in Spanish, well, I don't really understand Spanish that well. Other students may not understand that, if they write it in Korean, if they write it in Portuguese, Chinese, whatever, it's going to cause a lot of issues because we don't understand those, not everyone understands it. But it's the same basic principle, is that you're going to write down what you wanted to say, and then you're going to try to find out how to say that naturally in English. And I guess I'll kind of leave it there. I hope that was helpful. I kind of started out really focused, and then I kind of meandered. But if you're one of my current or former students, this is kind of the way I talk anyway. But I hope you find this helpful, and definitely read the summary and the notes, because ChatGPT is really going to pull out the main points from this talk, and I think that's going to help you as well. But I'll say it one more time. You are ultimately responsible for your language learning. There's not going to be a perfect textbook. There's not going to be a perfect class. There's not going to be a perfect teacher who can teach you everything you need to know. You have your own unique situations. Everyone has their own different contexts, different situations, different experiences, different things that they have to do every day. And so ultimately, if you don't know how to communicate something in English, or you don't understand something that happens in your daily life, you need to find out what that means or how to express that in English. And really the responsibility ultimately lies with you. And this is one of the best times in history for language learning because, well, maybe it's the worst, but it's one of the best times in history for language learning because you have these AI tools. I mean, the internet in general is going to help you a lot. But now you have these AI tools, LLMs like ChatGPT and Google Translate and so on. So you have a lot more power and a lot more, I guess, independence, right? You don't have to just rely on the teacher or native speakers to help you. And that's 24 minutes. I'm going to cut it off here. I'm going to try to have weekly podcast episodes again. I have 2 more topics in the future I'd like to talk about. I'm going to get more ideas from students as well for topics. But the next 2 topics I'd like to touch on is performative learning versus actual learning, which is something I may have talked about a while back, but I want to revisit that in more detail. And another one is the meta aspect of ChatGPT. I always like to make videos about how to use ChatGPT for language learning. I want to step back into what we call the meta aspect, and I don't want to talk about it now, but just something I'm going to be focusing on later. So if you're curious about that, it's the meta aspect of ChatGPT. I'll say one thing. So you have your conversations with ChatGPT. It's helping you learn English or helping you write letters or whatever. Maybe it's helping you with your vacation planning, your retirement planning. Maybe you're using it as kind of like a talk therapy, or you're bored, so you're just kind of chatting with it, telling it about your life's problems or whatever. I don't know, dating advice, whatever. And what you can do is you can kind of step back from that and ask ChatGPT to kind of analyze your communication style. It's very interesting. So those are two things I have in the pipeline, two topics, and then I'll get some more topics from students. I'll be going back into in-person teaching in about 4 or 5 days. And so for me, that'll be a good opportunity to get a lot of ideas. If you have any ideas on the YouTube page, you can always leave a comment or a suggestion for a topic. And then for my current students, I'll get some of your ideas in class.